Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along today. First of all, before we start, just to let you know that we are apparently being live streamed out across the internet as well for some other colleagues who can't join us. So if I'm standing here trying to keep myself slow and at pace, it's because not everybody is probably going to be able to see and join in just maybe the way that you can in the room. Before we start, if I could just first of all say thank you to NSMC for letting us use their facilities here today. It really is very much appreciated. We're delighted to be down here in Armagh, and thank you very much for allowing us to come along and to use your beautiful building to deliver out on this workshop today. Just to mention to you what the agenda is, we're going to try and keep ourselves to time and maybe even let you get out a little bit earlier than we had advertised. Always good to under-promise and over-deliver in these situations. We are, however, around today. We're very happy to take as many questions as you would like to put towards us. We may not be able to answer every question that you ask, but we will certainly do our best to do so. And we're very happy to stay around. If anybody has particular project ideas that you want to talk about, we're very happy to stay on just after the session today and be available to answer those questions on a one-to-one basis. So please feel free to use that opportunity as we go through the course of this morning. So if I could first of all introduce myself, I'm Lorraine McCourt. I'm the Director of the Joint Secretariat within SEUPB. And that means that with myself and the team, we're responsible for opening the programme to calls for applications, inviting those applications in, assessing them, and then ultimately getting a decision on those project applications through the steering committee, and then establishing the contract to see the projects forwards and through to conclusion. Paul Boylan here is one of our programme managers who's taking the lead out on the sustainable transport theme, and he's going to talk to you shortly. And we also have a number of other staff. We've got Claire here and Sean McAnulla as well, who are also available to answer some questions, and Louise is just out in the lobby there as well. So our timings for this morning really, first of all, I'm going to give you an overview, and apologies to any of you that kind of have heard this sort of overview of the programme before, but I think it's just worthwhile for those that maybe don't know it in as much detail, and to give you a little bit of context as to where sustainable transport fits within the overall complement of INTERREG funding. So I'm going to take you through that and some of the opportunities that are now available under sustainable transport. We're then happy to take any questions that you have in regard to that, and then after that Paul is then going to talk you through the application process, that if you are interested in making an application under any of the sustainable transport strands, or indeed any of the other strands within INTERREG, he's going to talk you through what the application process actually involves and just some of the mechanics in and around that. And again, we have the opportunity for you to ask questions and answer as well. We have suggested 3 topics for your questions and answers, and certainly seem to work well in previous events. We find that people do want to ask questions in and around value for money considerations and budget. Also, just what is required in terms of delivery structures and the requirement for partnership, because as you'll hear in a few moments, we do have a requirement for cross-border partnership within INTERREG. And then also quite often people want to ask questions about what the specific results and outputs are that they need to build into their project application. And certainly that really is the cornerstone now whenever you're putting together a project proposal, that you're very clear, that you understand exactly what your project is going to deliver, and that you can very clearly articulate that on an application form. You'd be surprised when we're looking at applications coming in, sometimes things do get lost in translation. You think you've been very clear, you think you've articulated what your project is, but you have to bear in mind that you've got a lot of background knowledge, a lot of conversation that has maybe been had with your other project partners. And when it comes in and it's being read by someone who doesn't know your project, sometimes you're not quite sure whether what you think something says on a piece of paper is what is actually meant, or whether maybe there's another type of interpretation that can be applied. But Paul will take you through that and give you some guidance as to how you can articulate your project on the form. Within your pack, you've got quite a bit of information there. What you have is you have a copy of the presentations from today. You've also got a copy of the Citizen Summary document, which gives you the overview of the INTERREG programme, and that's a useful document. I would still recommend any of you that want to make an application within any strand of INTERREG, please still go onto our website, open up the cooperation programme document. It's not the easiest read, it's a little bit difficult to follow, it's in a particular format at the request of the Commission. it doesn't flow maybe the way that if you wanted to sit down and write something, it's maybe not the way that you would write it to make it all flow in a logical sequence in terms of what we want to relay. So citizen summary is there to summarise that. But if you are making an application, I would strongly, strongly recommend that you look at the cooperation programme, open that and read the sections related to the particular strand of the programme that you're applying to, because there's a context that comes through, there's a sort of a nuance within the cooperation programme that will give you some additional information in terms of the backdrop of the kind of conversations that were had with the European Commission and ultimately what it is that we have agreed to deliver with their financial package. So it's worthwhile just having read that just to make sure that there's nothing that you're missing. You also have a copy of the application form for stage 1 and a copy of the business plan guide that you will need for stage 2. Now, when you're filling in an application form, while we're saying, and it is a shorter application form at stage 1 to kind of get the context of your application, you may want to just refer to some of the elements within the business plan guide, because some of that information you might want to think through in advance of your stage 1 application form, just so that you've got the right kind of budgetary figures and so on in there, and that you don't end up, when you do a bit more detailed work later on, you might end up finding yourself, well, actually, I wish I'd done something different. So the business plan guide is there, and that will explain to you what level of information we are looking for you to come back with if you're successful in getting a stage 1 agreement from the committee, what you'll need to come back with your detailed submission. You also have a copy of the programme rules, and again, essential reading if you are putting forward an application. What you will find in the programme rules is some very clear and specific guidance on eligibility of costs. Refer to it, look at it. The Commission this time around have given some exhaustive lists as to what they consider an eligible cost to be. If your cost is not on the list, the chances are it's not eligible and we won't be able to fund it. So make sure just when you're defining your cost, cross-reference back against the programme rules and make sure what you're building in there is ultimately something that we can reimburse, because it may impact on how you want to develop your project and the way that you would want to deliver it out there on the ground. So make sure you've just cross-referenced there. And also in the history of European funding, there's also a feedback form. So if you wouldn't mind filling in a feedback form and leaving it with us at the end of the day, we would very much appreciate it. So with no further ado, what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of an overview, just Interreg in general, and then homing in specifically on the 3 strands of funding that are available for sustainable transport, and then we'll give you an opportunity to ask any immediate questions that you have. I hope that we have a small enough group here today that we can be as informal as possible. We're very happy to take your questions as we go through, and this is your opportunity to get as much information from us as you want to get at this point. So use that opportunity today, and we're very happy to work with you as we go forward through the course of the morning. Okay, so just we're going to run through the programme priorities, a little bit of the context in terms of policy context that it sits within, then look at sustainable transport, and then, as I say, Paul's going to do the application process and the project information requirements, which is really primarily in relation to stage 2. Okay, so in terms of European programmes and the focus of European programmes this time around, the Commission found it very difficult to argue the case and to secure the budgetary provision for the whole suite of European programmes within this new funding cycle. And the reason why that was partly because it was very difficult for them to articulate back what the impact and results of previous rounds of programme finance had been. Certainly within the programme that we have just been involved in delivering and are currently closing out for Interreg, the INTERREG IV Programme, we had a wide range of different areas that we could fund. I think there were 11 in total in terms of different thematic areas. And it meant that within the overall budgetary provision, we had quite a broad spread of finance going across a number of different themes. And while individually each of those projects did deliver, there was quite a disparate range of project types, quite a disparate range of results and outputs that they delivered in the end. And it's meant that it's quite difficult then to report back what the aggregated total impact of all of those projects is. So this time around, the Commission said, okay, from their perspective, that didn't work as well as they would like it to. So what they'd asked for this new round of funding was that we had to be much more focused. We had to establish much more concentration in regard to the areas of funding, and we needed to demonstrate ways that we could clearly articulate what the impact of all of that funding was going to be and try and work towards that from the start. Not waiting to see what's come out of the end of the projects, but actually build in at the beginning of the project, what are we actively buying, what do we know we're going to deliver at the end of this. INTERREG, there is a mandatory requirement for cross-border cooperation and collaboration. And again, the Commission have also emphasised that they want that to be enhanced. They want us to focus in on that much more so. And as Paul is talking to you, and we work through the course of the morning, you'll see that what we're looking for you to articulate back within projects is not just why and how a project is being delivered on a cross-border basis. You need to explain within the context of your project what is the benefit of that. Why is the project better to be done on a cross-border basis than it could be done if it was being done on a single jurisdiction basis? And we have seen projects in the past whereby we've maybe had two distinct contracts, two organisations, one on either side of the border. They've had two distinct projects which are being delivered in parallel with cross communication and information sharing. But to a large extent, they've been independent projects, which at the end we can sort of say, well, we shared information, we shared expertise and best practice. And therefore, yes, there was benefit in working together and helping each other along the road as we delivered out on these projects, but they maybe wouldn't have been identified as being integrated cross-border projects. We now need to have integrated cross-border projects that demonstrate that there's an added benefit of working on that cross-border basis. So you will see a very much more enhanced focus on the cross-border value. You need to articulate that very clearly within your application. The big shift from the Commission's perspective, as I've mentioned, is results and outputs. You will see within the cooperation programme, and you'll also see within the citizen summary document that's available for you there, that we have clearly defined outputs and results that we need to achieve, and I'll explain to you how those are relevant with sustainable transport in a wee moment. That's at the Commission's request. In some cases, the Commission required us, we've agreed with them, to be very specific in regard to the outputs and results. We now are tasked with the responsibility of making sure that we deliver on those. You may look at those results and you may say, well, actually, I agree with that in part, or I've got a better idea than that, or I would do it differently. The reality is that's what's now agreed within the cooperation programme. That is what's agreed, and we need to demonstrate that we are actively delivering against that. It's great, we want to do it in an innovative way, we want to add value, we want to expand on what's there in terms of the added value of cross-border working. But fundamentally, when you're looking at a potential application, you need to look at that and be very clear that first and foremost, you're delivering out what's required within the programme, and then if you can demonstrate that there's added value to that, great. But just use the programme and the outputs there as your cornerstone. That's your starting point, and move from that. What the Commission have indicated to us, and what's now built within the cooperation programme in its entirety, is that if we don't deliver out against those results and outputs, the Commission could penalise the programme and take a financial slice off the programme at programme level. We don't want to be there. We've now got an opportunity for a significant investment within the region, and that's all of Northern Ireland, border counties of Ireland and Western Scotland. We want to maximise the value of that. We do not want to run any risk of losing any of that finance at all. So we will be very focused on making sure that whenever we're considering your applications, that we're very much focused in on, will this particular project help to deliver out what's required within the programme? And that's our starting point as well. So in terms of the context, we have agreed a cooperation programme that's sitting within a whole suite of European and national strategy and policy direction. We've got the Europe 2020 strategy, which is all about smart, sustainable and inclusive growth. And that's translated down through cohesion policy, and it has been used to inform the next round of funding programmes. But we also need to demonstrate, and it's been agreed with the Member States, that there are national priorities as well in respect to where we might want this funding to sit and what we might want it to achieve. So we've got a programme now that's agreed, and it's established within a European and national policy perspective, and we're hoping that through the delivery of that we'll be able to deliver out on some of those broad strategic objectives. As I mentioned, we have an eligible area. You can see it clearly outlined here on the map. So for the first time, there's a bit of a change for INTERREG in that previously Belfast was excluded, now it's included. So the eligible area now for INTERREG 5A includes Greater Belfast, and there's also an enhanced area that's included within Western Scotland as well. So we've got a slightly bigger area. Our funding package in total for the programme is 240 million, and that's the European complement. And in addition, there's match funding on top of that. So the maximum grant that we can consider from the European Commission's perspective is an 85% grant aid, which is, I think, probably one of the most generous grant aid packages of any of the European programmes, and certainly the ones that are being delivered out here. It's a very generous grant rate. That can be impacted, however, in that if there's revenue generation related to a project, if you're earning income out of it, we have to take that into account, because the Commission require us to offer the minimum amount of grant necessary to make a project happen. But we can go up to 85%. The other issue that we also need to take into account is state aid. Now, I think within the area that we're looking at the moment in terms of sustainable transport, we're not identifying that there should be very significant state aid implications, but we will need to scrutinise it on any project application in that regard. And effectively what state aid says is that if we are about to offer a grant whereby there would be a private sector interest to that, where it would provide a benefit to a particular private sector enterprise, and that potentially could distort international trade, then we have to take that into account, and we have to modify the amount of grant that we offer to make sure that it's compliant. And there are specific rules that are set out by the Commission for different areas of work and intervention, and they will provide us with a value in terms of a percentage value that's deemed to be appropriate, whereby they say under that value there's no impact in terms of international trade. So we have to look at it and be very clear with each individual project that there are no state aid issues there. And we ask you to look at that as well and tell us whether you think there are any, but we'll obviously scrutinise that again. But I think in the realms of sustainable transport, we're not identifying that there are going to be significant issues, but we will just double check on it. So those kinds of issues, revenue generation and state aid, can modify the amount of grant that we can offer. But in general, we can go up to 85% from the European Commission. And in addition, we've had conversations with the Member State accountable departments, and the Member States have indicated that they will be looking at making available the additional funding. So in effect, what you can do is you can apply for up to 100% grant aid for your project proposal. Now, we will be relaying your application. If you choose to do that, we will be relaying your application through to the relevant accountable departments in Northern Ireland and Ireland for the consideration of match funding. If you're bringing in a Scottish partner, Scotland have always, in the tradition of INTERREG funding, offered their own match funding, and that will be the same circumstance this time around as well. So Scotland normally the project partners bring their own funding, but in Northern Ireland and the border counties, you can seek an additional contribution from the accountable departments through government resources, and you can apply for up to 100% of the costs related to that part of your application. Two other things just to mention to you. In terms of where the money needs to be invested, we've got an eligible area. Within the programme in general, we can offer and spend up to 20% of the programme value outside the eligible area. I mention it because it's there. However, that's the exception, not the rule. So please just bear in mind that it's not a usual thing that we would do. And if you were to say to us that there's a need to invest in part of a project that's outside that eligible area, we'd be asking you to explain to us why that's appropriate and what is the benefit back into the eligible area. So for example, if it's a research-based project, you may find that there's a particular university that's undertaking research in something that's very specifically related to your particular project proposal. They might be the only research institute doing that type of work, in which case you might want to build them into your project. And there may be information sharing and so on in terms of the expertise that they bring to the project. So you might be able to articulate the benefit back to those other partners based within the eligible area. You just need to consider it. It's there, it can be done. I think again, in the realms of sustainable transport, we'd be looking at it very carefully to understand what's the benefit. So I don't see it being a major component, but you may see it within the information that we provide and the programme rules. So it's just to explain the context of that. And just to reference, in terms of the cross-border collaboration and cooperation, you must have partnership and your project must span at least 2 jurisdictions. So that can be Northern Ireland, Ireland, it can be Ireland, Scotland, or it can be all 3. Scotland, Northern Ireland does not count because it's within one member state. Okay, so you must have cross-border cooperation for an INTERREG IVA project. Okay, so just to give you a flavour for what's available within the programme. And this is just the overview of the programme in its entirety. And I'll explain to you where we're at in terms of the rollout of the programme as well, just to give you a sense for how this is all fitting together. The first area that we have there is research and innovation. And there's two strands to that. One is looking at research and innovation, primarily targeted towards two sectors, which have been identified as being, have been identified as being a priority, and where there's potential for increased capacity and further development. And that's in the areas of renewable energy and also health and life sciences. And primarily that's looking at university level research in conjunction with business and other stakeholders. So there's 45 million available under that strand, and we're looking at that opening towards the end of February of next year. In addition, we also have 15 million of European finance going out through the other component of research and innovation, which is primarily targeted towards small to medium-sized companies and looking at their innovation capacity. And that element of the programme, we've already opened that call, and we've now had the first applications be progressed through from stage 1 into stage 2 of for detailed consideration. So that has progressed on, and that call has closed, and we have a number of projects going forward there. In addition, we then have a number of strands under environment. We've got 72 million European investment in total there, and there's a number of strands included within that. That includes work related to habitats and biodiversity. It also includes opportunities for looking at the marine environment and marine management. There's also opportunities there for cross-border river basin management in terms of freshwater quality, and there's also opportunity for water sewage infrastructure enhancement. Now, the water sewage infrastructure enhancement, again, has already closed, and we have one application progressing on for detailed consideration. The other components under environment are due to close on the 8th of January, and those applications will be in with us then. We then have sustainable transport, which I'm going to talk to you in more detail about in a moment. But just to mention the final strand there on the right-hand side of your screen, which is 53 million euros of investment available, and that's for health. And there's a number of different areas for health that can be financed. Those relate to primary healthcare services, also health promotion and prevention of ill health, looking at services for older people, those that maybe are at risk of isolation and need additional support and assistance to deal with disabilities, vulnerable families, and so on, and also for the first time looking at opportunities for therapeutic trials. So there's 53 million available under health, and those applications have already been lodged with ourselves. So that first call for health has closed, and we're currently working through those applications, and we'll be taking those to a steering committee in January for consideration. But we're here today to talk about sustainable transport. There's three different elements to sustainable transport, and we're just going to talk you through the opportunities that are available, and just give you an opportunity to ask any questions in and around how that's targeted, what that includes. So anything at all that you're thinking about, please feel free to share it and ask. So the first one I just wanted to talk about was greenways. Can I just, a show of hands, just how many of you in the room are interested in this particular strand of sustainable transport? Oh, full house. Okay, good. All right, well then we'll focus in on that, and please do, maybe we'll just stop at the end of just a little bit I'm going to say and give you an opportunity. If there's any immediate questions, do feel free to put them through to me. So what we have, we had indicative budgets broken down for sustainable transport. I don't think that they were necessarily publicly shared. They're certainly not within the cooperation document. But in terms of the back working and the thinking, there had been an initial budgetary provision. That, before we released the call, was amended slightly in conjunction with the accountable departments in Northern Ireland, Ireland and Scotland. And we've a slightly adjusted budget here for greenways. So any of you that maybe heard a budgetary figure before and you're looking at this going, that's not what I remember, it's for a very good reason. And this is now the budgetary provision available. So what we have is we've got 14 million euros from the European Commission's perspective available under this call. And that means that by the time we add on an additional 15% requirement for match funding, it takes your budget to just over 16 million for the delivery of the greenways component. As I mentioned, you can bid in for up to the full value of your project. However, what I would just reference for you all is that whenever we're assessing your project, Paul's going to talk you through the criteria that we will apply. One of the elements is value for money. So if you are coming forward and you're saying, well, actually, we have the opportunity to either bring some cash contribution or a contribution in kind, or we're demonstrating some other form of commitment, just bear in mind that that's also helpful whenever assessors are looking at a project in respect to value for money. Not a core requirement, you can bid for the 100%, but there's benefits sometimes in actually demonstrating that your partnership are committed to the concept of the project. On this one, unless you are proposing a project whereby there is going to be a service charge for the usage of the particular facility that you're putting in place, I doubt that state aid is going to be an issue, but we just reference it again just to mention that it's there. So what we have within the greenways component is we have a number of results and outputs. Now, from the cooperation programme's perspective, and for us as an organisation in terms of SEUPB, we have a thematic objective agreed with the European Commission. We then have a result indicator, which is established, and that's what we have indicated to the Commission. We are going to try and deliver, and the impact that we are going to try and make with the investment of the finance within this particular strand. That result indicator is the indicator that we need to report back as an organisation to the Commission on. The result indicator is not for yourselves, it's our indicator that we need to report on. However, what I would just say is that whenever we're looking at your application, you're bidding in to deliver out on some of the outputs, or maybe all of the output that's identified here, but what we will need you to explain is how that would aim to make a contribution towards the results. So you don't need to necessarily demonstrate that you're delivering that full result that's being proposed there, but you need to explain how your project would help for us to report back to the Commission and say, yes, we have succeeded, we have delivered what we originally agreed with you at the outset of the programme. So in terms of the result indicator, the result that has been agreed with the Commission is that we are looking at increasing the percentage of cross-border journeys by either walking or cycling within the region. The current baseline value there that has been identified for that is that it currently stands at 2.7% of journeys are undertaken by those means, and the target value by 2023 is to try and increase that to 10%. Now, what I would emphasise is that we're looking at cross-border journeys, and one of the key issues that were relevant to this particular strand of the programme, whenever we were going through the consultation and the negotiation phase with the Commission were very specific in that they did not see the INTERREG programme as being a means by which we were going to be delivering sustainable tourism. It is not a priority for the Commission. In fact, they have specifically guided us away from that and towards looking at regular everyday commuter journey, and that is their priority and focus. So when you're looking at greenways, I understand and I know that there are excellent examples in other places within Ireland in terms of sustainable tourism projects which are creating immense benefit to the local areas. We are not disputing that in any way, shape or form, but what the Commission have actively sought through this programme and through the funding that they're making available, they've said they're not looking at tourism, they are looking at everyday commuter journeys. Okay, so please bear that in mind whenever you're putting forward your project. You may find that if you are creating a route, if you're creating a new greenway, that it may link to something which adds into a much longer route, which might have a benefit and an added value in respect to tourism, but it cannot be the central point by which you make your application. And if you're struggling with that, you need to come back and have a conversation with us, but just please, that is the cornerstone. If you make your application on the basis of sustainable tourism, you will find it will be rejected. Okay. The output indicator that we have to deliver on here is we need to demonstrate through the investment of this funding that we are creating a new greenways routes and that we create 80 kilometres of additional greenways within the eligible region. Now, we have not had it defined, and I'm very glad about that. It's not defined as to how many projects that needs to be, whether that's one, more, lots. There's no definition there, so you can apply for whatever scale of project in terms of the length and distance of that project that you think is appropriate within the context of your project. There's no minimum value there, but you will need to demonstrate how your project has value in terms of encouraging people to get out of their cars and start walking and cycling. Okay. So just emphasising there, it's about reducing cross-border car journeys. We're looking at strategic planning. The departments in terms of Northern Ireland and Ireland in particular have got sort of key linkages and cross-border areas where they've identified that there may be opportunities for looking at the enhancement and establishment of new greenways. So what we're looking at is things that can have a strategic value, that, you know, that they're really targeting in areas where there are significant population densities, whereby you're more likely to achieve the shift of getting people out of cars. But the kinds of things that we're looking at here, we're sort of mentioning, you know, we're looking at things like access issues, how you're going to deal with environmental and heritage requirements, route design, planning. So when you're looking at your project, bear in mind that yes, the establishment of these key routes in terms of the physical number of kilometres, that's kind of the output, but there's other things to consider in and around that in terms of how you go about it. Now, some of the key things, and we know some of you are very well experienced in the delivery of greenways, and there are very practical considerations that you will be working towards and planning in, and we would very much encourage you to do that, because we are going to be looking at exactly the same issues when the applications come into ourselves. And it's really about how you can demonstrate that your project is feasible, that it is actually capable of being delivered, that it's capable of being delivered within a budget which is agreed, which is not necessarily going to be expanded upon at a later stage if you run into difficulty, because we have a finite budgetary provision available, and we also have a finite amount of time available for the delivery of these projects. So the kinds of issues that you will all be very well aware of, but we will be actively looking at your application to see what you're saying about it, how you're intending to deal with it, are things like ownership. When you're coming forward with an application, particularly if you've got a longer route, do you know who owns the ground that you want to install your new greenway on? Have you had any preparatory conversations with those landowners? Is it in public ownership? Is it private? If it's in private, how many private owners? And I know from personal experience, from delivering some of these projects, that you can find yourself with a very short space of ground in terms of distance that can have many, many landowners involved. And that provides immense complication whenever you're trying to deliver out on a project. So how are you going to deliver and deal with that? And bearing in mind that when you go out and you start talking about anything that involves funding, particularly when people hear European funding, they think that that is a license to print money. And you may think that you have an agreement in place in terms of a concept, and everybody's agreed and signed on to a concept, and the minute you start making real moves to try and deliver out on something, you find that individual landowners say, well, actually, hold on, sorry, stop a second, I'm not entirely convinced. So how likely is that going to be for your particular project, and how can you guard against that? How can you manage that risk? And again, other issues that cause major time delays are things like, you know, if you're working in an area where you've got protected habitats or species, what kind of interaction have you had with the government agencies, and what kinds of permissions are you going to need if you're going to be involved in working in those areas? In terms of your planning and your design specification, what kind of design specification are you putting forward? That will have a major impact in terms of your costs, but it also has a major impact in terms of whether or not your particular project has the potential to link up to other projects in a longer term way, and we will need to be looking and making sure that we are getting a consistency of quality standard. So look, there are good guidance notes out there in terms of quality standards and recommended construction standards for these kind of greenways. Make sure that you're working in a way that is going to be broadly compliant with those, and that you're not coming forward with something which might at one perspective look like good value for money because it's a more cost-effective option to deliver. But if it's not going to have the structural integrity and the quality standard there, potentially that's going to cause difficulties later on down the line. We're also looking at whether or not, in terms of your project, while our output is about the number of kilometres that we are delivering out for the Commission, we're looking to see, well, what other elements of activity have you built into the project? It doesn't all have to be just physically about creating the infrastructure. You need to look and determine whether within the overall scope of your project, have you looked at and identified the activity packages, the networking, the engagement that you need to undertake with the local community to make sure that the community have bought into the concept, and that they're actually going to use the particular project that you're developing whenever you get it concluded and completed. So how are you going to encourage people to actively engage and see that as a resource for them on an everyday basis? And also looking at things like what provision you're making for those with disabilities, bearing in mind that when you're providing something which is disabled access compliant, it's also going to be of immense value to families and those with small children. So just looking at the broader considerations, not simply just looking at how many kilometres, how can I get that done and what's the budget? How can you make it the most user-friendly, suitable project which is going to have impact and value to the community within which you're going to be installing it? The other key element, and you'll see what we're asking for now, while it's not scored at stage 1, we are asking the question just to get a sense for what your answer is going to be, but it most certainly will be actively scrutinised and considered at stage 2 with your detailed submission. What is your long-term sustainability? What's your exit strategy out of a project? European funding by its nature is short-term. It's project funding, so it has to be something with a start, a middle and an end. And the funding will come to a natural conclusion within a 4 to 5 year period. What are you going to do whenever that European funding is gone? How are you going to make sure that your project is sustainable in the long term? So in particular, in respect to greenways, you're installing infrastructure, which is wonderful, but again, from previous life within local authority, it's great to install things, but then the next question that your elected members will ask you is, well, what's it going to take now to maintain it? And you need to think about what your maintenance budget is going to be. How are you going to sustain this in the longer term, particularly if you're creating a facility which is not going to be charging for usage. You're not generating any income out of it. How are you going to make sure that it is sustainable and that you can actively maintain it in the longer term? We don't want to be financing things which have a very short lifespan on them and whereby you put a huge amount of physical and infrastructure and investment in, and within 5 to 10 years it starts to degrade back into a facility that nobody wants to use anymore because it's either deemed to be unsafe or unsuitable, because that's to nobody's value. So we're looking here in terms of the projects. We're going to be trying to focus in on those projects and investments which can demonstrate the greatest capacity to impact on carbon emissions, and that's really about bringing about a shift in transportation patterns. So it's about that everyday commuter traffic. How can you impact in terms of carbon emissions and get people out of their cars, on their feet, on their bikes, and using that as a convenient means of everyday transportation? Just to mention, these are out of the cooperation programme. There are a number of areas which were identified within the programme as potential opportunities. This is not an exhaustive list, so you can do things in other places. What you do need to do whenever you're proposing their project is to explain why you're putting it in the location that you're putting it, what the value of that is, and what the potential impact of that is. But you can't, it's not an exhaustive list, it was just a list of suggestions. So I'm just going to pause there. Are there any immediate questions just in regard to greenways that anybody wants to ask, or are you happy enough for me to just move on and talk about the other two components? Yes. Yep, we've just got a microphone here. And it's just, again, it's just to allow for the streaming so people can hear.
You touched on the route design issue.
Yes.
Taking it back a step further, is there an agreed definition of what a working definition of what a greenway is that you consider? And that ties into route design in terms of, you know, sometimes they're completely traffic free through parkland. Other times it's very difficult to get complete segregation, high standard in urban environments particularly. So within the applications, how flexible are you on that, and what's the starting point as a
We're
definition?
fairly flexible. And I think, you know, within the cooperation programme, it is not defined, so it does leave us some scope and flexibility. Obviously, if you're going for off-road, that's optimal in terms of that it's safe, it's convenient, particularly if you're looking at family-based activity. So we would like to be trying to prioritise as much off-road as we can, but we are not. It's not defined within the cooperation programme that it must be. So if you're looking at an overall route, you may find that there are elements whereby that may present complication and difficulty, but we're looking for you to maximise it wherever possible, and obviously it will come in under your quality of project design in terms of that component, in terms of the assessment of that. The more you can get off-road into what is deemed to be greenway in terms of, you know, that type of quality standard, the better. But it does not have to be exclusively.
I suppose the other thing I was linking to that is rough calculation of the maths is 14 million euro, an 80 kilometre target is about 150,000 euro per kilometre, which again in urban environments in some tricky areas could be quite
tight.
Tight.
Yes.
So how does that play into everything? Or
Well, it's an issue that has been identified. This is the budgetary provision that we have at the moment. The budget has been enhanced a little bit compared to what it had been previously looked at. It's one of those things I think we need to see and understand the monetary cost of projects. It can vary quite significantly from one project to another, depending on the location and what is required to bring the infrastructure up to the required standard. We need to see what range of projects we have there, and then determine what is affordable and see whether or not we need to negotiate any adjustments to budget with the Commission, should there be an opportunity to do so. But at this stage, we do know that that's an issue. We just invite you to put in your project based on what you need, and then we'll review it whenever the applications come through to ourselves. Pamela.
On-road, is that counted towards the Greenway as well? If there's parts of it on road?
We'd need to look at that, but yes, there's no definition at the moment within the programme that says that it must be off-road, but we will be prioritising those areas which are off-road. But if there are very real reasons why something cannot be achieved in that way, we'd be looking at what the added value or what the benefits are of the entire route and then going, but we do want to try and prioritise as much off-road as we can.
Sorry, just the methodology for potentially measuring the output being 10%, and an increase of that from 2.7. You mentioned in your presentation the need to include the mechanisms for consultation within the community and the establishment of community buy-in. But how would you propose, or how would you see an application proposing to measure the outputs, that increase to 10%?
I don't think the project has to measure the output. That's the outputs is, and from the project perspective, is about how many kilometres that you're delivering. So that's what you're measured against. At a programme level, it'll be SEUPB that will be aggregating the information in terms of the results and referring that back. So there's already a baseline there in terms of what's established, and it'll be building on that through existing reporting mechanisms. So from the project's perspective, you're primarily looking at the outputs, but giving us an indication as to how you would identify that would help us to achieve the results. But you don't need to worry so much in terms of at an individual project level on the results. That will be looked at by SEUPB for the programme in general.
Yeah, I just wanted to check, if you had two different projects in the one council area, is it possible for that council to be involved in both projects, or is that seen as a conflict of interest?
You can. We have no requirement as to how many projects any organisation can be involved in or apply for. Obviously, the more that you bid in for, it means that, I suppose, the downside is that you're spreading your own resource quite thinly, and that you're actively trying to develop and deliver out on more than one project proposal at a time. Ultimately, if it's a competitive round, not everything will be funded because we just won't have the budgetary provision available to do that. And there will be a judgment call for yourselves as organisations as to where your time investment is best placed. But we're not restricting you by way of how many applications you need to be involved in.
You mentioned working with communities along the routes, and presumably also working with workplaces where people
Yes.
are employed. Does the fund cover revenue as well? Because that's an important element in behavioural change to get people to use the Greenway. So the fund covers both capital and revenue?
It does. So you can build in revenue costs. However, I would just, again, take into account the fact that just in terms of the overall budgetary provision, it really is just about the balance in terms of what's required to make your project happen and making sure that your costs are proportionate.
Yeah. I mean, our experience through Sustrans would be that capital revenue is about 70 to 30%. So
Yeah.
that's
Yes, you can build in the revenue cost. Okay. One final one, and then maybe we'll move on and we can come back and do another wrap up at the end.
Sorry, just an extension to that question. So revenue costs for the period of the programme, would that be correct?
Yes. So your project, when you apply, you'll be applying for a project which will span a particular time period. So you might identify within your project, it may take you whatever, 3 years, 4 years to physically install. You might identify that during the course of the development of the physical infrastructure, you want to do a level of activity, and you may have a degree of activity that you want to do at the end whenever your infrastructure is completed. You can build all of that within the overall scope of your project. What we'd be asking you to define for us is how long will your project take to deliver from the beginning in terms of initial concept right through to conclusion, and that's infrastructure and any activities that you need to deliver. And we will offer you a time period in respect to that and budgetary provision in respect to that.
Thank you.
Okay?
Just to inquire, you're covering the modal shift element later on, is it? Or can
You ask.
yeah, I don't know. Our proposals can also include, therefore, connections to train stations and bus stations as well.
Yes.
And is that likely to be seen in a more positive light if we are connecting in with public modes of transport? Can I ask?
Well, I think whenever we're looking at quality of project design, if you're identifying that through the delivery of your project that you are linking through to bus stations, that you're actively establishing those linkages, then that's demonstrating that your project has added value beyond the physical infrastructure that you're putting in place in terms of the number of kilometres.
Yes.
So that does factor in, and you need to clearly articulate that within your project, because that will come in under the quality of the project, and it will then result in a higher score.
Yes, and then modal shift also meaning that kind of increasing walking and cycling numbers during the weekdays
Yes.
rather than just at weekends.
Correct.
Also. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. All right, we'll just go on. We'll take you through the other two strands, and then I'm happy to come back and take any remaining questions. So the next one then that we've got under sustainable transport is the electric vehicle infrastructure component of the programme. The budgetary provision on this aspect has been decreased slightly to allow for enhanced budgetary provision for greenways. So at the moment we have a budgetary allocation here of €6 million from the programme. And again, when you add on the additional component, that gives us a budgetary figure for the delivery out of just over 7 million, including match funding. And again, the departments, both North and South, have indicated that they will look at making available the funding in Northern Ireland and the border counties as well. Under this particular component part, what we have here is we've got results and outputs again. The result indicator here is really focused around trying to increase the level of interest, I suppose, and the number of people who are actively choosing to buy and use electric vehicles on an everyday basis. And it's trying to increase the current baseline value, which is identified across the eligible region, including Western Scotland, of 186 electric vehicles registered, up to 2,000 vehicles registered by 2023. Now, when we were originally looking at this element of the cooperation programme, the original concept looked at whether or not we should be offering out finance towards the purchase of vehicles. That component part of it was not agreed with the Commission in the end. The Commission were not keen to go in that direction. So what we now have is what we are looking to deliver out on is to enhance and upgrade the existing electric vehicle charging point network, and that through the delivery of an enhanced network, the hope and aspiration is that that will positively impact on the number of people actively choosing to purchase the vehicles. And it was also in recognition of the fact that there are existing investment schemes available for those that want to purchase electric vehicles. So what we have here as an output within the programme is to try and, we're trying to increase the number of rapid charging points by 2023 by 73 new, or upgrading the existing charging points to 73 rapid chargers. So that's really to try and provide confidence to those that are using electric vehicles, and to get us away the charging points at the moment in terms of the standard charging points. As I understand it, can take 3 to 4 hours to do a full charge on your vehicle, where the rapid charging points would be 30 minutes. So it's to try and provide enhanced confidence across the eligible region in regard to there is a network there that will physically allow you to deliver a longer journey in a way that is user-friendly and achievable within an everyday situation. So say it's about looking at the number of vehicles, but that's our result to articulate back to the Commission. So that's the aspiration from the programme's perspective. The outputs here for those that are applying would be in respect to the charging points and where those would need to be. So the kinds of indicative actions that have been looked at here is really looking at the upgrading of the existing charging points, establishing another network or an intermediate network throughout that of rapid chargers, looking at how we can ensure interoperability on a cross-border basis of the network as well, so that there's no degree of concern on behalf of electric vehicle users that if they get to another point in their journey that they will find that they're not actually physically able to connect in and charge up. And looking at how we can enhance connectivity and cross-border mobility, and obviously taking into account the opportunities for Western Scotland as well. So it's really just about looking at how we can enhance that, and we also here have an aspiration in terms of even looking at the ferry journeys between Northern Ireland and Scotland in terms of what can be made feasible on ferries as well, in terms of utilising the time that people spend on those forms of transport as well. Can I just ask, in terms of those of you that are here today, is anybody considering coming in under electric vehicle infrastructure? Anyone?
Would electric bikes, which are not, obviously aren't the same. Would electric bikes be considered?
I think it's going to be difficult for us to consider that because the result is all about trying to encourage additional electric vehicles in terms of the cars was the way it was defined, but I can check on that for you and come back.
And if it were possible, because I would see that we might be able to push that quite well in our area.
Okay.
Would there be, I don't know the technology, possibility for fast charging of those batteries?
Let me pick up on that. We'll come back. I can't answer that question for you right now because I'm not sure. I know that the conversations that have been had with the Commission were primarily focused in and around cars and vans and that kind of infrastructure, but we will check on the bike situation. Okay, thank you. We'll certainly check for you.
Yeah, just wanted to ask, would that include the better signage on where the charge points are?
Yes.
Because there's lots of charge points that aren't.
Yes, and I think it's all about getting that information out there, enhancing that confidence on behalf of the user and making sure that they know where those locations are, that they're not just trying to find them.
And again, I suppose the other big point is we've recently heard that the DSB in the south are going to put up their charges. So financially, a person that has an electric vehicle is now worse off than a person that would have bought a conventional vehicle.
Okay.
So that's probably a big disincentive for people too.
Yes, yes. We understand that there's a number of issues there at the moment. We are looking at it from the point of view of what the programme can invest in. And we'll certainly pick up on the point in terms of the bikes. But at this point, yes, information can be included, activities can be included, the charging points in terms of the physical infrastructure, again, can be included. What we will need to understand is with any project that's being presented under this strand is whether or not the charging points are then going to be charged for in terms of when you plug in that you're paying per usage in terms of the actual electricity that you're buying through that, and whether or not there's an impact there in terms of state aid. So those are issues that we need to navigate through, but we will be having further conversations with the accountable departments in each of the jurisdictions to try and work some of that through as we move forward. Okay. So the final strand then under sustainable transport is in respect to a multimodal transport hub. Now within the programme, there was one location identified as having opportunity, and that was in the northwest. We have had one application in which was withdrawn, and we're now re-advertising this element of the programme again to provide opportunity. My understanding is that application will be resubmitted with some additional information included within that. But what we have available here is 20 million euros, which corresponds to a total potential project cost in the region of 23 million. And that is for the establishment and installation of a multimodal transport hub, which really is, again, about looking at the linkages, establishing the connections between the various forms of public transport and how we can maximise the value of that on a cross-border basis. And again, match funding can be bid in for through the programme. So what we're looking at here in terms of the results for ourselves to report back to the Commission on is to increase the number of daily passenger journeys using cross-border public transportation services by 2023. The current baseline has been identified as 8.8% of journeys are currently using public transport systems, and the target for 2023 is to get that up to 25%. And the means by which it's identified within the programme to achieve that is by the installation of a multimodal transport hub, which includes integrated services. Now, the kind of elements that can be delivered in here in terms of indicative actions is obviously, first of all, the creation of the infrastructure in terms of putting that in place. And we're looking in particular, and I know that the Northwest is there, I've mentioned that it's identified within the programme. We're looking at urban areas which are close to the border, where you can maximise that cross-border value, and where we can benefit from an integrated approach in terms of planning and the delivery of services on a cross-border basis. So we're looking at how we can integrate bus services, train services, cycling, infrastructure and so on. And there's a high degree of complementarity in terms of the greenways component and potentially what can be delivered in terms of the multimodal hub within a particular area as well. But while the programme defines the output as being the installation of the physical facility in terms of we're installing a hub, it's about more than that. It's really about looking at what, again, are the added activities, what is happening in terms of the integration of all of those services. So we're looking at the potential, for example, in terms of integrated timetabling to make sure that it's convenient for users, that when they get to one point in their journey that they have a natural means of ongoing transportation. We're looking at whether or not you can have, for example, some integrated ticketing, or linking that up in some way that makes it more convenient for users, that they're paying one fee to get the entire distance of their journey. We're looking at how we can link in park and ride schemes to make people convenient to use the hub and use the public transportation for ongoing transport means. How that links to public cycling schemes, car share schemes, which some businesses are actively promoting through business usage, and also how we can look at increasing the means of public transport use. So that's the hub. There's 20 million available under that. That theme is going back out again. It went open again on Friday there with the other elements of sustainable transport. And I think it's probably quite well placed, because at least now we're seeing the entirety of the project ideas coming forward at one time, and we can identify what the complementarities are between those project proposals and how we can add value at a programme level in terms of how some of those projects can add up to have a value that's more than their individual parts. So who can apply? Well, to be honest, pretty much anybody can apply. I think primarily in terms of the sustainable transport areas of the programme, we probably will see public sector agencies, transport companies and sort of regional authorities being the main applicants. But in terms of the programme on eligibility, almost anyone can apply, although there are some complications in terms of private business just because of state aid issues and so on, in terms of whether or not they can be a lead partner. But it is very open in terms of the range of applicants, and this is a fully open call that anyone can apply underneath the individual strands. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do have very specific cross-border partnership requirements. You do need to have a cross-border partnership which involves 2 member states. But we're also looking for projects to demonstrate good corporate governance and partnership arrangement. So you really need to think about, within your partners, who's doing what, how does that come together, what are your roles and responsibilities for each of your individual partners, and do you have a clear means by which you're going to manage that. We will be asking for an application through from one organisation as a lead partner. That organisation ultimately ends up being the recipient of the grant and establishing a contract arrangement between SEUPB and the project partners in their entirety. And that organisation then takes on the responsibility for making sure that that project is delivered out. So if you're the lead partner, you want to know and understand and be sure that each of your other project partners are going to play their part, that they're going to play it fully, they're going to stick to the original agreement in terms of what the project was that was going to be delivered, and that they actively delivered out on whatever has been agreed within the overall structure of that project. Because it's so result and output orientated, there is no opportunity here for projects to start out on one basis and then end up deviating off to do something completely different. That's not possible, and therefore as a lead organisation, you'll want to make sure that you know what everybody is going to do and that they are going to stay on message and deliver out on the original agreed project. You also need to demonstrate, in terms of the requirements, there's 4 component parts to the requirement under cross-border partnership. You have to be able to demonstrate joint development of your project idea. You need to be able to demonstrate joint implementation of your project as it's being delivered out. And then there's 2 additional requirements, which are an either or, but I would strongly recommend that it's a both, because you'll get added value and it'll be looked at more favourably if you're demonstrating delivery of all 4 parts. So you've got joint development, joint implementation, those are mandatory, and then your either or are joint staffing and or joint financing. And if you can do both joint staffing and joint financing, that's better. So just bear in mind that there are specific ways that the Commission are now identifying and defining what it means in terms of cross-border cooperation and collaboration. And when we're scoring your application, we're being very specific and looking at it. So it's like a job application or a tender situation. There are core requirements within each of the individual questions. Make sure you answer the question and that you clearly identify against those 4 elements. What are you saying in respect to joint development? What are you saying in respect to joint implementation? What are you saying about staffing? What are you saying about financing? And if you actually break it into 4 elements, it makes it easier for the assessor, and you can also have confidence that you've clearly articulated your point in respect to each of the 4 criteria. So as I mentioned, the lead partner is the key link organisation from our own perspective. That organisation will accept a grant offer and are then required to ensure that the project delivers out on all of the grant conditions. And you'll be responsible for coordinating the other project partners that are actively delivering out on that. What you will also find within this, we've got lead partners, final recipients, in terms, if you see that terminology used within our documentation, that's really the people who ultimately benefit from the project. So if you're installing greenways, your final recipients and beneficiaries are those individuals who are actually going to end up using the infrastructure that's installed. So just that you understand within the programme terminology what the differences are between each of those different elements. So just to conclude, what projects should do, obviously demonstrate that you're complementary to and that you're actively delivering against what's required within the cooperation programme and what other projects and funding streams are out there. You need to demonstrate that you are using cross-border cooperation and collaboration to deliver out on something which is about joint activity and joint benefit and tackling a shared problem. It's not just about delivering, as I said, on either side of the border. It's about what are you doing in terms of a cross-border shared problem and that you're delivering and tackling that together on a cross-border basis. There has to be more value to cross-border cooperation than there could be on delivering the project on a single jurisdiction basis. In terms of your partnership, make sure that you have a relevant partnership. Make sure it's the right organisations coming together that will actively help you to deliver out on the project, and that there's no glaring omissions within that. So if we think that there's somebody that's really obviously should be there and should be represented, but there's no mention of them, either tell us why it's not appropriate and why they're not there. You know, don't just leave it hanging. But we'd be asking you to explain to us, in terms of the partners that are coming together, why are they the right people? Why are those the right organisations? Do they have a core remit for that particular area of work? Do they have responsibilities already in that regard? Why are they appropriate? And you need then to have the right skills and capacity to be able to see a project through. Now, we can help you with capacity. We can help you to finance the staff that will be needed to develop and deliver a project, but you need to tell us what you need and why that's the relevant amount of staffing for that particular project. So you'll need to have a well-designed and transparent management structure, show how that works across your partners. How does that link up? How do you talk together? How often are you going to do it? Who gets to make decisions? You know, all those practical everyday situations. If you work that out, I know it sounds complicated and burdensome to kind of work that all out at an early stage in a process, but it will really add much value to your detailed development of your project. If you do that early and clearly define it, it'll make life a lot simpler later on as you go forward with your detailed design. And just make sure that your project has clear results and outputs, a clear schedule for delivery that is achievable within the programme period, bearing in mind that, particularly with greenways, there will be fundamental issues that will inevitably hit your project as you go forward to deliver it. How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to manage the risks about that? And make sure that you can communicate out your successes and the achievement of your results and outputs clearly within the context of your project. How are you going to know that you've actually succeeded to do what it is that you've set out to do, and that you'll be able to clearly articulate that back so we can say, yes, you've succeeded, and here's the full complement of the finance that we'd agreed to pay to you as you move forward. So that's really all that I wanted to cover in terms of that overview. I'm happy to take any remaining questions, and then I'll hand over to Paul then to talk to you about the application process.
in the past, in the County Louth area, in the past in the County Louth area, we have built a couple of these greenways and cycleways, but on reflection, I think there's been a need for promoting and signage and maps and interactive mapping or something like that, so that people, when they arrive in Newry or Dundalk or Derry or whatever it is, they can go onto the internet and go onto a Google map and find where the cycleway starts and where the connection is, and find the interconnecting bus stations, blah 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 blah. That's missing, I feel, in a lot of the infrastructure that we've built already. And I'm wondering, can that also be accounted for or allowed for in our submission?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we'd be looking at how you can link up with other forms of information that are out there already. So how do you link in with the information sources that are already available through major public transport companies, through the departments? Is there an existing network of information, rather than you having to try and create a new website, brand a new facility, go out there and market that, because it takes a lot of time to get public awareness built up for any particular information source. So is there a convenient means by which you can get that information out there using existing information sources, but feed into that? But then that again brings in the whole question of who are your project partners? How do you link through with those other opportunities that may already be there? Which means that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and you don't have to spend significant amount of money in investing in new IT infrastructure, for example, to enable that to happen.
Thanks, Lorraine. Two questions, just if I could, please. Going back originally to the comments about landowners and security of tenure, what's the minimum requirement? Is it a leasehold, or would it be would a permissive access be sufficient? And in terms of funding, does the programme fund purchase of land or the payment of that lease throughout the duration of the project? Notwithstanding, it would have to be part of an exit strategy anyway. And then the second question is in relation to staffing costs between lead partner, and particularly on a cross-border basis. Will other partners be allowed to have staff costs as well? Okay. Take the second one first, just because I'll remember it quicker. Staff costs, yes. You can define the staff costs that are necessary and appropriate for your project across the entirety of the project. So it doesn't have to be based specifically in the lead partner in terms of their organisation. You can finance staff posts in other places. What you need to explain is why that's necessary, where it adds value to your project, and make sure, obviously, that whenever you're identifying the staff posts, that you're clearly articulating what kind of role that person or that post is going to fulfill, and make sure that it's graded appropriately in respect to the roles and responsibilities that the individual is going to have. Now, one of the things that you need to consider in terms of staffing costs is we can look at if there's an existing member of staff in post that needs to be allocated over to a project. That is possible, but what we need to be very clear about is that European funding cannot duplicate costs. So if you already have a means by which you're financing that individual through another core resource or whatever, you can't just bill for this individual's time again out of the European fund. You need to demonstrate that either that person's post had come to a conclusion, and therefore they're now being offered over onto a new project, which is the project you're bidding for, or that their finance has been released to do something else. You can't bill for the same person out of multiple funding strands. But we can finance staff posts, and we can finance that in a range of organisations. In respect to the issue of tenure of land, we don't have it defined as to what that needs to be, but what you will need to clearly articulate within your application is whatever the means by which you are intending to secure the tenure and the access to the land, how vulnerable is that to the change of mind of an individual? So are you allowing them a break clause that with 5 minutes notice they could decide, actually, do you know what, you've just invested 5 million in the creation of a major infrastructure network here, and one individual somewhere in the middle of that owns 100 yards with 5 minutes notice can say, do you know what, I don't want to play anymore, and the whole thing falls apart. That's not going to be a robust project proposal from our perspective. You can look at lease arrangements, you can look at path agreement arrangements, but how much flexibility and scope are you affording to the individual owner to be able to disaggregate and break the entire project
because they've changed their mind, and what hoops would they need to go through to do that? How secure is this project in terms of that it is there, it's going to be there in the longer term? In terms of land purchase, yes, we can finance land purchase. The Commission have a requirement whereby we are not allowed to invest any more than 10% of a project budget within land purchase, unless it's for nature conservation purposes, in which case the value is slightly higher. But for something like greenways, the maximum value is 10%. However, taking into account the questions already raised in terms of the overall budget available for the theme and the fact that it is neat, if you start getting into the realms of having to buy significant tracts of land, you will find that very quickly your project is not achievable, just because of the requirement that you would need in terms of its overall budgetary requirement to deliver.
For lease during the duration of the project?
We can consider it, yes. So we can, whatever it needs to deliver out on your project. But again, that brings you back into the question, if you're paying for lease arrangements during the delivery of a project, how are you going to finance that when the European funding is gone? And again, it just impacts in terms of the more elements you build into your project, your costs are going up all the time. How are you going to make sure that that's still achievable in terms of the finances? And what are you going to do whenever our money runs out? So if you're saying that your project is a 25-year project, and after year 5, when the programme comes to a conclusion and you're left sitting, where does the money come from?
If the new infrastructure facilitates commercial development and job employment, do you include those benefits into the application form?
Yes, absolutely. Obviously, focus in, make sure that you've very clearly answered the benefits in regard to what the programme is looking to achieve, and then tell us about the added value and the other dimensions, which just demonstrate that it is a good quality project proposal which has additional spin-off impact into your community. Okay, just conscious of time, I think what I'll do is I'll invite, if anybody wants to get water, please, there's a water station here in the corner, and then I'll invite Paul to talk to you about the application process, and then we can pick up on any remaining questions at the end.
Great. Thank you. Hello everyone, I'm Paul Boyle and I'm one of the programme managers with SEUPB. I'm going to talk you through the application process and the business plan process, and please feel free to stop me as I go through the presentation and ask any questions as we go along. I'm aware that it's nearing lunchtime as well, so I'll try and make this as quick as possible. So SEUPB conducted 2 extensive consultations last year in 2014, and a lot of the feedback that we received from potential applicants and applicants to the previous programme was that there was no certainty around decision making and timescales. We've taken that on board, and there's now a 36-week timetable for decisions on applications. This is how it breaks down. It's a 2-stage process, so we're trying to keep it short and sweet at stage 1, and it's really looking at strategic fit. So we'll keep the call open for, say, 4 to 6 weeks. We are looking for you to complete the application form, which is in your pack. The application form we're hoping is going to be available online early next year, but you have the downloadable versions, and we'll accept either or early next year. We then hold the steering committee within 8 weeks, and I'm pleased to say so far we've held the steering committees earlier than anticipated, so applicants have been able to progress with their business plans even quicker than we originally anticipated. We then invite the stage 2 applications forward, in which case the projects go off and work up their business plan, which is a fairly comprehensive document, which is then submitted to SEUPB, and then we take 22 weeks, well, a maximum of 22 weeks to analyse that information and then give you a decision and offer you either a letter of offer or rejection letter, which you would have the right to appeal as well. So that's the new application process. It's 2-stage, it's definitive in time frame, it's a maximum of 36 weeks, and we will endeavour to do it quicker than that, and have done so far. Okay, so when we receive your stage 1 application, we do a basic admissibility check on it. We check that it was received on time, it was authorised by the accounting officer who's representing the organisation that's put forward the application. We also have an FOI section in that application form, so please ensure that the senior officer signs that as well. We've seen a few applications coming forward, and we don't want to rule anybody out on those grounds. We need to know that it benefits the eligible region. It's not fully completed. We can fund activity back to 2014, but we can't fund projects which have already completed in their entirety. And the activities are eligible according to both the programme rules and the call. So at stage 1, we have 5 criteria which we assess the applications by, and they all have the same weighting of 20%. So we're focusing on the 5 key areas of the programme, which are the results and outputs, quality of the project design, cross-border cooperation, governance and value for money. And I'll talk in a bit more detail about these in the coming slides. At stage 2, we extend that and we shift the weightings around. So we reduce the quality of the project design down to 10% and introduce 2 of the cross-cutting themes. That is sustainable development and equality. SEUPB is hosting other workshops focusing in on what sustainable development and what equality is for the programme, and I would encourage you to attend those workshops if you watch our website for future events and future dates. So the selection criteria, at stage 1, we're obviously looking at your project meeting the results and outputs of the programme. So we're looking for you to detail there exactly how you propose to do that. So if we are saying 80 kilometres of greenway, how much kilometres are you going to deliver and how are you going to do that? You have to spell it out in very clear detail to us as a secretariat who make a recommendation to the steering committee who ultimately take the decision. So you have to bear that in mind. The steering committee is made up of a different organisations. We have accountable departments there who have policy expertise. We also have equality representatives. We have environment representatives. We have business representatives. So there's a mixture of people on the steering committee that ultimately take the decision on the applications. So you have to bear that in mind when you're drafting your application. The final audience who's ultimately taking the decision on this needs to be able to interpret the information and apply it against the selection criteria. So I would just sort of ask that you bear that in mind. Quality of project design. This is imperative, and this is where I've seen so far some of the projects not necessarily articulating it very well. So I would ask that you put forward how you're going to manage your project, the methodologies, the nature of the team, the detail of the team and why they're there and why they're adding value. And again, bringing that in at the project team and implementation arrangements. Value for money, it's obviously a key element in any public decision around finance, and we'd ask that you give that due consideration. Our rules are very clear on some of the eligibility, so we'd ask that you take your time to review, I think it's section 7 of the rules to the programme, which is in your pack today, and go through that in detail if you have any deliberations over budgeting or what is eligible and what's not eligible. And then with the 2 cross-cutting themes, well, I suppose just before that, the quality of the cross-border cooperation. Why are you doing this on a cross-border basis and why is it adding value? That should be evident, but you have to spell it out in black and white to us and make that clear in your application form. And then stage 2, sustainable development and equality are also key selection criteria. So we want to fund projects that clearly deliver the results and outputs. It's different to the previous programming period where we had a result which we wanted to achieve around economic growth within the region. We didn't then stipulate how you go about delivering that. This time, we very much nailed our colours to the mast, and we're saying we're wanting 80 kilometres of greenway because that will give us the modal shift. We're wanting a multimodal hub, and we're wanting 57 rapid charging points because we believe that will deliver us the result as detailed in the cooperation programme. So that's taken a lot of the creativity out of the equation, but we would still ask you to deliver some creativity around how you deliver the output, because there's different ways and means to go about that. So we are looking for you to focus on that in terms of your outputs. you must demonstrate cross-border and community cooperation. Lorraine's touched on that quite a lot, and I can't stress this enough. I mean, if we don't have community buy-in to projects of this nature, you're not going to work. It will lay there as a sort of white elephant, if you like, and we don't want to fund projects like that. We want projects that are used and that are well held by the community and well regarded by the community. Corporate governance and partnership. That's a given. Most of the organisations that we're working with will have partnerships agreements already in place with the various delivery agents, and I suppose we're looking for you to articulate that in your application. The quality of the project design. We would expect, if you're delivering out in greenways, that you'll have consulted some of the Sustrans guidance around this. Sustrans is a cross-border body as well, a charity obviously, and they will have details out there on what they consider good practice, and we would expect that to be adhered to when delivering out on the proposed greenways. And that again, that comes into quality of project design, value for money, sustainability and equality. Sustainable development, I'll come on to exit strategy a bit later, but Lorraine has touched on that around if we're funding a piece of infrastructure, who's going to pick up the pieces when the project funding is gone. And that's imperative to us because we need to know that these projects are sustainable. Okay, so the stage 1 application form, you have a copy in your packs today. I'm just going to talk you through that. So the first part of the form is fairly evident around how the project fits with the programme, and it's essentially a tick box at A1 and A2 around the project location. We're obviously focusing on the cross-border region here, so we anticipate that most of the infrastructure will be crossing the border at some point in time in order to give us the result that we're looking for. I would ask that if you're not crossing the border, that you come and talk to us today to articulate why you still think that adds value. And then the project location, again, you'll need to spell that out in terms of how many kilometres and exactly the area that you propose to cover in your application. So the first section, B1, where we get into asking you to write a bit of narrative is around the results and outputs of the programme and directly aligning it with what we have in the call. We would like you, particularly around the outputs, to be expressly clear on how you will deliver that. And there's a lot of subtext in the call for application around some of the outputs and indicative activities, and we would ask that you look at that and detail how you propose to meet that also. It's not simply the high level output, although that is what we want. We want you to encompass some of the other aspects which we've detailed in the call for applications. Project design. We obviously want to fund well-designed, high-quality projects, but you need to clearly detail the change you wish to achieve, and that's particularly where we're looking for a modal shift in the distance of the path, and we'd ask that you think about that when you're putting forward your application. So what can you reasonably expect people to commute to the various towns and centres along the border region in order to deliver out on the output and the result ultimately. So we'll ask that you target your beneficiary groups. Do you know the population sizes? Do you know the demographics of the region? Do you know the commuting infrastructure currently in place? How many people cross the border on a daily basis? What length of journey do they take? How do you then translate that to your project and what you want to achieve? And ultimately, how do you try and measure that? But that's more of a stage 2 part of the application form. And then the sub-criteria, which I mentioned earlier. So projects must be joint developed and jointly implemented. We would like to see all 4 ideally, but they have to be, well, either or, joint staffing or joint financing, but we would expect most of the applications to encompass all 4 of the cross-border demonstrable added aspects that are up there at the moment. I suppose one of the key things for us so far is being, why do you have the project partners that you have? It's not enough to say, well, they have advised in the past, it's saying where do they add value and really narrowing down to what you think is essential to deliver your project, not what is desirable, but what is essential to deliver your project. Again, at the project implementation team, we would expect the management structures to be outlined at the stage 1 application. Who's going to deal with the project management? Who's going to deal with delivery? What's going to be the conduit between the people managing the project and the people delivering the project? And how are you going to pull that all together for ultimately the success of the programme and the project? The partners involved, again, I mentioned about ensuring that you have the right mix of skill sets and no obvious glaring omissions within your partnership. We would expect to have a degree of buy-in from the local cycling community, potentially the local community groups that are involved, so that we have community buy-in to deliver out on these projects, and we would expect to see them representative somewhere in the mix of your project application. We want to see the budgets associated with projects. I think one of the things that always arouses suspicion, particularly with ourselves making a recommendation to steering committee, is partners that don't have budgets associated with them. There might be a perfectly laudable reason for that, but often you think, well, are they superfluous if they're not delivering out on activity? But that's one of the things that we come across quite regularly. The project budget, we have a fairly rigorous set of financial reporting mechanisms, and we would expect you to be familiar with that. I mentioned Section 7 of the rules, and we would expect you to be able to articulate how you would propose to deal with those rules and how you would ultimately cash flow the project. We're looking at a turnaround between 3 and 6 months for claims sometimes. So how would your project sustain itself in the intervening period? What's your cash reserves? Who's underwriting it? Do you have sufficient cash flow in order to bankroll the activity, particularly if you have a contractor on site who's invoicing you on a monthly basis? These are the sort of things that we would look for you to detail. The budget simplification, we have the option of simplified costs, which you could apply. So you may find that it's beneficial for you to apply a kilometre as X amount, and then we could look at that. I don't know how that's going to work in practice, but that could be a proposal which you may want to give consideration to, and we could play on the basis of the output as opposed to the invoices that are being received. But we'll need a detailed breakdown of the costs, and again, sustainability. Who's going to maintain the infrastructure once the funding has left the arena? There's 6 cost headings which we have now through the application form. We would ask that you detail your indicative costs against those headings, and I suppose this time round we have a degree of flexibility, whereas before we had, you know, in some cases up to 30, 40 sub-budgets, and we had a bit of issue sharing money between the subheadings. This time it's fairly high level, so we would expect that the partners would all be clear that it's unlikely to change throughout the lifetime of the project, and that's at a high level. Unit costs, I mentioned those earlier. If you are interested in unit costs, again, speak to us today. We'd be certainly interested to hear your views on this. Anecdotally, I don't think it's going to necessarily be applicable to this, but there may be something that I've missed out, and more than happy to hear any ideas that you have around that. The indirect costs, we have under the simplified costs a flat rate of 15% against the costs, and that will apply to this call and all of the calls actually. So the key issues for stage 1 when we're assessing the application is, does it meet the programme results and outputs? Do you provide evidential statements that support that, and what you activities are going to result in and ultimately give us the output? Is the delivery mechanism robust and deliverable? Are your timeframes correct? When land acquisition is incorporated, that gives me a degree of scepticism, particularly based on our experiences where we hope to acquire land within a 6-month period. That's never been the case in any of the projects which we've been delivering. So if you have land to acquire, we would ask that those negotiations are advanced and that you start taking that on board now rather than later. Are the right partners identified in the engagement? Is it meet the requisite EU and national regulatory and policy requirements? Again, I mentioned Sustrans being the agency which we rely on for a lot of our information on greenways and the requisite standards around that. And does the proposal represent value for money? I think we've already touched a little bit on cost today, and there's no one size fits all. It depends on where you're delivering. The nature of this works will depend on how much it's going to cost ultimately. So that's stage one, just a whistle-stop tour. Any questions on the stage one application before I get into business plan? Yep. Panel.
And I think it's difficult in some parts of the form to truly get across what you're actually doing because of that restriction.
Yeah.
And it's really for the applicant trying to work out what needs to go in there and what can you leave out and still hope that whoever's assessing it gets your project.
Yeah.
You know, and that is very much a difficulty for any applicant, I think, in this.
Yeah. The character count is there for a reason. We are assessing potentially, 30, 40 applications in a very short time space. Plus, we don't want people to be wasting time writing chapter and verse and ultimately not be successful at stage one. So we've found that the character limits that we've got just about strike the right balance there. But it's the same for everybody. And that's the premise that we're sort of working on.
Yeah, but I still feel it's about, are you able within that character count to give the proper overview of your project?
We found that they have. To date, some projects have really articulated what they plan to do, and we've been able to score them accordingly.
Okay.
Just on that point, I was the person that asked a stupid question about the character count in terms of are spaces included or not.
Yep.
And you kindly came back to me and said that spaces are included in the character count. And that imposes some difficulty in terms of how information is presented in response to the answers. Therefore, we cannot waste spaces. We can't put in tables, etc. It's just in terms of the layout of the presentation of the information, which can assist in presenting a very clear picture to the funder. And I'm just wondering, can that be reconsidered, or do you feel it's necessary to reconsider it?
Yeah, I suppose I'll hand over to Lorraine in a minute, but I'll just give my view on that. The character count is there for a reason. We don't want people being overburdened, and we don't want to be overburdened with the task of trying to interpret the information. There's a degree of this that if you cannot articulate in a sentence to someone in a pub what your project is, type thing, then should we be funding it if we don't understand it? That's one of the key aspects that we sort of take away. So we are looking for you to articulate it very clearly in a very short space as to what your project will do and how it will do that and the associated finance. We've found that from the stage one application that we first put out, we have increased the character limit, and that has enabled the projects, particularly under the SME call and the health call, to articulate themselves in a shorter space of time, and we found that probably about right. There's no science to this, unfortunately.
I suppose the one thing that I would maybe add in is that just to bear in mind, and it's something that we've been working through as an organisation as well, and the staff and the others that are becoming engaged in the assessment of the projects that we've been quite clear about. Stage one is about the strategic overview. So I know whenever you, particularly in value for money, you then start getting very naturally drawn into operational detail. How is it going to work, and starting to think about the practicalities of it. We're very much looking, stage one is about strategic fit It's about how your project proposal sits within the context of the programme and what's being sought. So it is about very much providing that overview in terms of how does your project proposal sit alongside the requirements that we're looking for. We're not looking for you to provide a huge amount of operational detail in terms of all of the mechanics, but we're looking to understand some key things. As Paul says, so far, and you'd be surprised from an assessor's perspective, you'd be surprised how quickly you can actually pick out the key elements within a project and the key weaknesses, even with a short amount of information. And sometimes actually providing too much scope, you see that applicants start to go off on tangents. So it's not always beneficial to give you too much space, because it means that you start building in things that actually provide more complication than are helpful by way of the information provided. So just maintain a strategic overview. It's about fit with the programme. Look at the specific question that's being asked and answer the question that's there in front of you. And when you look then in terms of the business plan guide that Paul will take you through now, that then gives us more scope in terms of looking about how the project is going to come together. But in the first instance, it's about whether or not the concept is the right concept and whether the right people are going to be engaged in delivering that out. Operational, we will deal with later.
Thank you for that response. Can I just further clarify, the character limit includes spaces?
Yes.
As counting?
Yes.
And my point is that that imposes a constraint on how information is presented in responses. I'm not so concerned about the need to be concise with regards to responses, and I accept that. It is the presentation of information and the paragraphing, etc., and perhaps the inclusion of tables, which concerns me most. So it's a slightly different question. I'm sorry to revisit that.
No. I mean, I think the key issue from our perspective, we don't actually have flexibility on it, because while at the moment we're getting the application forms in Word format, they are all going to have to be fit and retrospectively applied into a database. And when it goes into the database does count the spaces. So we don't, because that's the way that the information will be documented and stored later, we don't have the flexibility now of being able to say, let's just ignore the spaces. It's because that's the way it's going to be physically uploaded later on, unfortunately.
And that would be standard practice in submitting any online application. A space counts as a character. Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, just as a follow-on to that. Section 8A of the application has a column which states the rationale and evidence to support the costs, and it's just for clarity purposes. What is your expectations and on the evidence that would be required to be included with the application as separate documentation, or are you expecting that rationale is to be inserted within that particular column space?
We would expect it to be inserted within the column space.
Right, okay.
There's no, apart from your constitution, your governing document, there's no other supplementary information coming alongside this application form.
Okay, and then just with the connectivity between those costs and the phase 2 application, and the expectations, there shouldn't be a huge deviation between those costs. Would there be scope then in phase 2 to be able to provide the rationale if there isn't sufficient space in phase 1?
Certainly.
Yeah, okay, that's great, thank you.
Okay, I'll continue on now to talk you through the stage 2 business plan. So if you're successful at stage 1, we would sit down and have a conversation with any successful applicants or unsuccessful applicants if they wished. And we'll talk you through some of the key areas within the application form as we've seen that need to be addressed. So there'll be a face-to-face discussion had at the point at which you receive your notification of the stage 1 outcome. So there is, before you embark on the business plan, there'll be a fairly frank discussion around what we see are the issues on the application form in order to assist you with developing your business plan. So the business plan has 11 key elements of it. I'm just going to pick out a few as to what we see as key and then talk you through. The proposed project results, outputs and targets, given that that's what the programme is all about, we will look to see that being a fairly substantial piece of work within the business plan. The need and demand for the project, I have a slide which I'll come on to a bit later, which talks you through a bit more about demonstrating why your project is needed and where the demand is coming from. The budget and financials, stage 1 application, doesn't provide you with enough information to articulate exactly why you need all the costs that you need, and we would certainly afford you that opportunity at stage 2. The management arrangements and governance arrangements, why are the partners given the requisite budget, and why are the governance arrangements that are proposed sufficient? These are the sort of questions that we'll be looking at. The monitoring and evaluation of the project, what's your baseline? Where are you starting from? What are you hoping to achieve? How are you going to evaluate that? Are you going to have counters? And when are you going to put the counters in? And when are you going to monitor the counters and so forth? The exit strategy, and again, that's around the sustainability of the project. So we would look for you to articulate in your stage 2 business plan the results to be achieved, the facilities proposed. I suppose if you're developing a piece of infrastructure which is, 10 kilometres long. Why is it 10 kilometres long? What type of surface do you propose to use? Which is the width, the dimensions, what planning permissions are in place, all of that, what statutory undertakings in terms of permissions are required. There's an economic appraisal, an environmental assessment required, and these will be things that we'll ask you to detail at stage 2 when you're putting forward your application. Obviously, the more that you have undertaken this, the easier it is for us to look at the application and score it higher. In terms of the need and demand, who's going to use it? How many people? What type of person? Are these commuters? Are they people using it for recreational purposes? Are there cycling groups? Are they community groups who are using the proposed facilities? And how are they going to go about that on a daily basis? So is there anything else in the region that delivers this? And what are the benchmarks? So if you already have existing routes, you would have existing data on the types of people using that. So we would like you to draw on that and bring that into your stage 2 application to help evidence the potential supply in the region for your projects. Again, what's the arrangement for managing the project in terms of the legal roles and responsibilities, the project's functions, the relevant skills and experience of the organisations involved? Have you done this before? Do you know the contractors that are available? Do you know the types of work that you'll be undertaking, the quality of the surfaces that you'll be delivering? You need to have the appropriate balance. I think you touched on earlier about the balance between revenue and capital. You need to bear that in mind in terms of your delivery of your projects. Are you striking the right balance there, both in terms of how many people are managing the project versus how many people are delivering the project? And again, the financial risk and exposure, that's key for us. Organisational viability. What we've seen in the past with organisations is we'll set up groups and they quickly dissipate when the finances are no longer available because the momentum isn't there driving it. So what's the sustainability around that, and how are you going to deliver on that? The corporate governance and procedures in place for dealing with finances, for instance, are you regulated? Do you have policies and procedures in place? Before any grant is going out, we would undertake a check on the financial viability of a project, and we'll be asking you to evidence a lot of that up front in your stage 2 business plan so that we could ultimately do as much of that in advance as we possibly can. So, where we are with the stage 1 applications, obviously the call opened on Friday of last week. We're closing on the 29th of January, so that's the date at which your applications need to be with us. I think it's 3 p.m, and we will then look to hold the steering committee at the latest by the 23rd of March to assess those applications. If the applications are successful in moving to stage 2, we will notify the projects, have a debrief meeting, and then ask them to go away and work up their business plan and submit that within 6 weeks of the date of the steering committee If the steering committee's earlier, we'll take it from the date of the 23rd of March, in case you're worried about timescales. But the steering committee ultimately will make a decision on this call for applications on or before the 7th of October next year. So that's it on the stage 2 process. As I mentioned, we will have, for any successful applicants, a debrief meeting which will be able to fill them in a bit more about the expectations should you proceed to stage 2. Any questions? Hamlet?
No, it's just on the greenways again. It's new greenway.
Yes, it's
so
new.
The physical build. So I suppose I'm thinking about the Newry to Carlingford one, where the councils have committed and have built some greenway to date.
Yep.
So the project would be linking that and opening up a cross-border greenway, which is now at present, and opening up a number of kilometres, but the actual build would be obviously less than that.
That's
so
correct, yeah.
The project will be assessed on the new as opposed to the impact and the value of having the total.
That's correct, yes. It's new greenway.
Sorry to ask another question.
No.
I'm the person who's put here to ask a silly question. So anyway, this is about, it's just really to hear you again tell us about the commuter thing. Lorraine mentioned that very clearly that it's about cross-border commuters. Mm-hmm. And then there was some reference there, Paul, on what you're saying about recreational and cycling groups. Mm-hmm. So I just really would like to hear clarification for the final time, and I'm sorry for asking you to repeat that.
So I'll just mention my reference there. My reference to cycling groups is I would assume cycling groups are a key group which currently use facilities. So they would be a body which you may wish to consult in the development of this proposal. So that was my key point, yeah.
I suppose maybe just to link the two questions there that have been asked in terms of the value of existing versus what's required. Within the programme, the criteria that we have to apply to the assessment of the projects is about creation of new greenways. We've got a target there of a number of kilometres that we need to create through the programme investment. And that's really the cornerstone, and it's about that commuter traffic. However, you may well put forward an application where you're saying this is what we're delivering against your core result and output. And in addition, there are spin-off benefits that this project will also deliver out on, which could be about the other ways in which the facility are used. It could be about that additional linkage to other routes. So there may be other things that you want to articulate within your project in terms of added value. So those are the things that are beneficial too. But whenever we're looking at the core requirement in terms of what the programme is doing, our first point of reference has got to be what are you delivering in respect to the cooperation programme requirements, and then okay, great, we've identified that, now what's the added value as well, and that just helps to bolster the support for your application.
Can I ask what your definition of a commuter is?
Within the cooperation programme, I'm not sure that we have a definition of commuter, so it's one of the things that you can identify, and I think it's probably better that we don't have a fixed definition at this point. So within your project, you tell us how your project delivers for commuters, and there's some opportunity for you to define what that means for you.
There is reference made to midweek journeys. Midweek journeys.
Just a follow-up question in relation to the cost. There's provision in there for optimism bias. Yeah. What would your expectation be on the percentage that should be put in there?
We would look for you to apply the industry standard. So if there's projects which are out there and there's a recognised standard in terms of this work, then we would look for you to apply that. We don't know what that is currently, but we're quite happy for you to bring that forward.
I think as well, it will depend on the nature of your particular project. So for example, if you've got a project where there may be an element of engineering work that's required, until you get detailed design spec on that engineering work, you're not going to know what the financial cost of that's going to be. So within your stage one, you can identify how much you're factoring in there for OB, in terms of what your contingency fund is. As you work forward and you get more detailed information, perhaps with your stage 2 submission, that may come down a bit, but you'll still have a residual amount of contingency or optimism bias within your project proposal, which allows you to deal with a slightly elevated cost or an unforeseen eventuality. But it's about, for your project specifically in terms of where you're putting it in, how much of that is a known quantity for you at this stage in terms of, you know, have you delivered a similar project in another place and you know that the cost of that was X per kilometre and this is broadly comparable? Or is there something substantively different about your specific location, which means that there's a greater degree of doubt and you need to factor in a higher level of contingency for that particular project? So you can define it for your individual circumstances. And again, we just look and see, well, is the rationale behind that reasonable and appropriate?
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Possibly a foolish question, but going back to commuters, can you also, can we see that potential commuters, people who are young and whose attitudes to how they travel at the moment can be changed by use of a greenway, even though we may not in actual fact initially have them going across the border? I mean, it will be cross border, but they may only use a small length of it initially. Can that be seen as part of commuting?
Bring forward the evidence. And
Yes,
we will look
yes,
at it.
Yeah,
yes.
potentially yes. Just bear in mind that the programme, in terms of the results, we have to demonstrate specific targets and results by 2023.
Yeah, I think that would be
So
happening.
we're just bearing that in mind.
Just with regards to the results, the 2.7 up to the 10% and any the contribution that these greenways will make to that, you're not requesting at this point in time at the strategic level in stage 1 for us to present numbers against that, are you?
Not specifically, but it would be useful for you to identify if where we've maybe not got the level of information that would be most helpful within stage 1 applications at this point, is to understand how many individuals you think might actually be impacted by your specific project. So if you can give some numbers around that, then that gives a degree of information in terms of how much impact that might make towards that result indicator that we're reporting back on at programme level.
So that suggests to me that a starting point would be good to know what the 2.7% is in terms of numbers and what the 10% is, so that we know what if we have a number, what our number is contributing.
And we can get that. The managing authority, we're engaged in setting those baselines, so we can get that through from the managing authority within SEUPB and get additional clarity.
So can I take it that'll be sent out to everybody, or?
We can do, yeah. We'll make that available.
Where one of the greenways is going cross-border, and you stipulate the 80 kilometre length of new cycleway, is there any ratio of what percentage has to be on one side? Or, I mean, could it be 90% on one side of the border and 5 and 10% on the other side, to take an extreme example? Or are you looking for some more even parity of equal, within reason, equal distance on both sides of the border?
We don't have a definition in terms of what's required, but bear in mind that it has to be a genuine cross-border project. So if you have 90% of your budget, 90% of your activity and 90% of your results and outputs on one side versus the other, then it will raise questions, but it's up to you to demonstrate and justify why it's reasonable, appropriate, and how it still impacts on cross-border commuter traffic.
Can I just ask a question on the multimodal hub? And you have talked about the Northwest there, Lorraine. Is it envisaged that all of the money will go to a project? Or could you possibly have some money, say, for example, in the Northwest and elements in other parts of the border region?
I think the way the programme is designed at this point, it is envisaged that it will be one project. There is a requirement there for a multimodal hub. Now, if we identify or the application comes in terms of the delivery of a hub with integrated servicing and so on, if that doesn't need the full complement of money, then, you know, and we end up that we've got remaining budgetary provision, then that might open a different conversation. But the requirement within the programme is for a hub. Okay. All right.
I think that's it. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll bring to a close there. Just to say, obviously, Paul, myself, Sean is here as well and can answer any questions. Sean will be actively engaged in the assessment of projects. We are around over lunch. We're very happy to take your questions. Thank you so much for coming along today and putting us through our paces here in terms of trying to answer your questions. We have some remaining pieces of information which we will get back out to you in respect to the issue of bikes in terms of charging, and also then the issue in terms of the baseline figures, in terms of the numbers within that baseline for greenways. So we'll get that information and make that available on our website. But I think really just for now, thank you very much for coming along. We are here over lunch to answer any remaining questions that you may have. And following today, if you do think of other issues that you would like to ask about, feel free to contact through to ourselves, through to Paul and Sean and the team, and we'll try and pick up on those questions after today as well. Thank you very much.